all know, as you have rightly pointed out, and this was, I think, a recurrent theme yesterday as well, that COVID has really brought home to us the invaluable role that CSOs have played and play in enabling vulnerable communities to access basic services. And as you had rightly said, Avni, uh, out of the estimated 3.3 million, am I right? 3.3 million CSOs who work at fragile frontiers, I might call them that. The Pan-Indian survey that you cited reveals that the biggest challenges faced by them was coordinating with the government and a lack of access to knowledge about the functioning of government. I think that remains a perennial and crucial capacity need. Government at times seems inscrutable, almost sphinx-like, and some very often impermeable. And I think it's important for us to understand also this kind of Janus face of the government, uh, which is often open to certain kinds of groups that wishes to access it for its particular interests, and that is sometimes extremely exclusionary in terms of other groups. So this whole dual sort of face of the government is something that really needs to be unraveled, especially for those of us and those of you who work every day at what is known as the grassroots, or what is really the foundational edifice of democracy. Um, so it's important to understand what determines these choices for government. Is there a logic of exclusion that is built into the very structure of governmental response? We need to be very sensitive to this whole issue of governmentality, the technology or the pathology of power, and also the values, the knowledge, the practices that underpin our own perspectives of governance and how we normalize and legitimize certain processes of control. So governing linked mentalities, not just about government, but about the way we see ourselves in that web and that whole matrix of interrelationships, and how we rationalize or normalize certain kinds of exercises of power is actually important. So, and the reason I asked whether Atishi is joining us today was because it's particularly significant to have her here in our midst, because as we grapple with these various dimensions and issues, her own experience is really a kind of hands-on experience and significant. Um, when I last met Atishi, she was campaigning for the 2019 elections. And here she was in the midst of a Congress dominated constituency trying to put across her point of view. And there were very many, within quotes, enlightened citizens who decided to give her advice on how suicidal it was going to be for AAP if they did not forge an alliance with the Congress at that point of time. Um, she listened very patiently. She responded to every, shall I say, contrary opinion. And by the end of her presentation or her talk, I discovered that she'd opened up an enormous dialogic space. And it occurred to me that she may have even converted about 50% of those rather, shall I say, within quotes, erstwhile committed voters. And I thought to myself, I think this is really what responsive, potential responsive governance perhaps needs to look like, and needs to find greater space on the firmament of decision making. So she then, I think, is really no novice to politics as the art of the possible, beyond vote banks and beyond garnering electoral gains, because she straddled many worlds that in some senses interface with our own. Before joining AAP, she was brilliant academic career, Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, then went on to teach history at the very progressive Rishi Valley School. Um, Her parents, of course, activists, mother very deeply involved with the teachers movement at Delhi University. And of course, her middle name, which caused a great deal of flutter during the elections, really, as I understand it, a combination that her parents worked out between Marx and Lenin. I think that's why Marlena came into the picture, but that may not reflect her current politics at all. But she, as a key member of the manifesto drafting committee in 2013 of AAP, advisor to education, and we've seen the impact of her work in the schools in Delhi, the unprecedented kind of reforms that have taken place in the school sector, and also what is relevant and salient to us is her earlier work at the Sambhavana Institute of Public Policy and Politics, nestled away in a village in Palampur, but working towards bringing about this change in terms of understanding of citizens' engagement, young people's engagement with environmental issues, with justice issues, with citizenship, and of course her involvement in the Khandwa Jal Satyagraha in Madhya Pradesh to protest against the lack of so-called rehabilitation of people who were affected by the Narmada interventions. So she has, in that sense, tenanted the spaces of both theory and praxis, and would be an ideal person to sort of, shall I say, engage with, to build this sustained dialogue and sustained conversations to fashion, in a sense, a new discourse on this whole relationship, because you're looking at the nuts and bolts. You talked about them, but we are also sensitive to the keys and the locks that create both structural constraints. What are the enabling spaces that exist? But just a few thoughts before that. I know I'm maybe running out of time. Till government actually acknowledges and truly recognizes that accountability, even if it's not from a normative perspective, even tactically enables efficacy on the one hand, and till CSOs find that fine balance between purely adversarial politics on the one hand and the supplicant service provider role on the other, it will be difficult for the twain to meet. And the Delhi government has emphasized, I think, the importance of strong citizen state engagement. And we must all concede that the citizens' experience of government has been somewhat not as unpleasant since the AAP took over. You know, whether it's the Mohalla clinics, whether it is getting the certificates online. I mean, the kind of ease of doing business which the corporates talk about has been to some extent, or to a great extent, uh, been changed in terms of the citizens' experience, the Delhi citizens' experience. So the whole idea is that if the whole, shall I say, conundrum of seeing CSOs largely either through the lens of the being located in the development sector or in the human rights sector, I think those divisions have become extremely blurred, and they need to, because there are there is a need to not anesthetize the engagement, you know, because if you look at it from a rights-based perspective also, the role in securing a robust and vibrant democracy is equally important. As you know, both the 73rd and 74th Amendments were not talking about local governments as purely service providers. There was a very important dimension of the whole notion of how accountability and engagement works. And I was particularly impressed with Rajika's definition yesterday of decentralization when she talked about it holding elected bodies to account. You know, she emphasized the accountability aspect. Please tell me when the time is running out, if I have already. But again, to go on to the moral economy of the bureaucracy, which your state capacity initiative at CPR has highlighted. What are the values? What is the framework? Does it ever come into focus when policy decisions are made? I think I will stop here. There are several other questions. There are conundrums about the ethical framework. There are conundrums about the lines between the so-called development. But above all, the justice issue and whose voice is it anyway is important. And I think from Atishi, what one would really look to is to understand how she has used the policy space, bringing her rich, shall I say, engagement with the civil society sector, and her way of doing things. Has it changed? And it's interesting that there's another whole dimension of discussion on that, the transition in the discourse between moving from the NGO or the non-governmental organization to the CSO. That itself is a journey. Have the SDGs in some senses anesthetized this whole engagement, this robust engagement, this aspiration, the heat and dust of subaltern aspirations? Has it anesthetized it? Has it managerialized it in some way? And it would be wonderful if you could ask many of your colleagues and those who are here to share with us their experiences of how transiting from merely finding voice to actually engaging hands-on with governments and within quotes also the limits of governmentality would be very, very instructive for us, because this is really a dialogic space, and I cannot claim to purvey any great wisdom or new insights that you people don't already have. But when we spoke about the moral economy of the bureaucracy, and you rightly said, it's not about finding a good BDO who will open doors for you, and then, as you said, she gets transferred and you start from scratch again. It's not about it, it's about institutionalizing. But how do you significantly determine the manner of institutionalization? How flexible must it be? Yesterday, Mirai Chatterjee very, very effectively pointed out that sometimes citizen engagement requires strategic retreats. um, and what is, so the timing and how you bricolage between the prescriptions and the prescriptions of government, there's a whole untenanted space of shall I say, the interstices between what governments don't prohibit and what they enable. So how do you find, in a sense, as you call them, the tools, I would call them the predispositions to engage with that? That would be an important question for us. Um, and I said, as I said, even though public institutions often are manned, within quotes, or womaned by very well-meaning officers, they are today routinely being called out almost on a daily basis, because the state of exception is becoming the norm of governance. And also because I think the executive is over eager to dispense retributive justice without waiting for the legal, the slow, sometimes somnolent legal machinery to play itself out. And these impact property rights, access to the commons, livelihoods, displacement, a whole gamut of issues. So how do CSOs see their role in both fast tracking decisions without the punitive aspects of governmental alacrity coming in the way? We know about all the summary arrests and so on. So I don't have to really go down that path. So we have to look at an institutionalization process that's also sustainable. And you can let me know whenever Atishi comes, and we can stop. I can stop immediately. Uh, there's also the other aspect, Avni, that what are the new strands that have been added to the so-called development discourse? Have the SDGs diluted that, the intensity of that engagement in some way? Has it anesthetized it? Has it, as I said earlier, managerialized it? The UN sanctified SDGs. What have they done in terms of the way in which we perceive this whole landscape of citizen interaction? For me, that would be a question that you might want to ask uh, the really informed and engaged audience or participants that are here. Um, I'm also particularly concerned about how the public discourse has turned issues of human security, or shall I say, marginalized them and foregrounded really issues of what is called national security. And what does that do in terms of governance? Does it become very law and order oriented? And what does it do in terms of the response of government? And I really like Rajika to come in here and to inform us. Again, as I said, how do we get out of this service provider uh, trap? I really would call it trap, and this eternal supplicant trap, and introduce a new discourse. Uh, you know, and so our sort of terms like capacity building, advocacy, stakeholders, are these proving to be shibboleths? Or are we inventing new terms of engagement? I won't say endearment. And also, does this help us to unravel the complexity of Indian society as it exists around the fault lines of class, caste, gender, religion, and where where the state, where some groups are engaging in a more, shall I say, productive, if you want to call it that, bargaining process with governments, uh, whereas others don't have access, as you said. And also when governments increasingly are bookending electoral cycles to either respond to certain kinds of issues as opposed to others, how do they set the hierarchies of choice for themselves? Because the moment that happens within the electoral domain or the electoral compulsions, there is also an inevitable polarization that happens. How do CSOs ride that polarization? Atishi, I think, is here, and it will be wonderful to hear her um, and more than what I can offer. So, welcome, Atishi. I was just sharing with you, with the group, that when I last met you, you were wearing your campaigning hat, and how you converted a group of somewhat unbelieving voters to your point of view through creating a space for dialogue. And that was for me a metaphor for responsive governance.
Thank you so much, Meenakshi. And it's an honor to be introduced by you. We are all familiar with your great work in the field of education. And thank you to CPR for inviting me for this keynote address. And so I'll just uh, jump right into it. And when I was setting up this Zoom call, and I am currently in my MLA office, I'm speaking from there. And I was just thinking, a few days ago, I was sitting in the same location, and there was a program, there was an education related program that had to be recorded. And when the person from that concerned channel came, and they were looking for a place within my office. Now, I sit where I'm usually sitting, and this is where my table is. And so he said, the cameraman said, "Ke, Madam, ऑफिस में कोई और जगह यूज कर सकते हैं क्या?" एंड आई सेड, "क्यों?" ही सेड, "यहाँ पे ना पीछे आपके पार्टी का सिंबल दिख रहा है, एंड हम ना पॉलिटिकल बात नहीं चाहते हैं, हमारे शो में सिर्फ सिविल सोसाइटी की वॉइसेस हैं और आपकी ना गवर्नेंस की वॉइस चाहते हैं हम, सो इसलिए आप कहीं और ऐसी जगह बैठ जाइए जहाँ पे आपके पार्टी का सिंबल नहीं दिखता." And I think this was a very interesting, the reason I'm starting with this is because I myself have, before I came into politics, been in the civil society space. And the reason that I start with this is because I was asked to speak on citizen state engagement. And I think that because having come from a civil society background myself, having worked in nonprofits, social movements, etc., I think that when we talk about citizen state engagement, I think two things which are extremely crucial in this entire equation that we often forget about are democracy and politics. I think that this entire citizen state engagement cannot be understood without the context of understanding how democracy works and how politics works. And I think these are things we cannot run away from, and which we should not run away from if we are actually, as citizens, looking to make an impact. And I think that is where many of us who have been working in civil society tend to fall short, because we maintain this stance कि जी हम politics की बात नहीं करते हैं, हम apolitical हैं. But the problem is कि nothing is apolitical. And the entire, I mean, frankly, it is a myth of the idea of good governance, frankly. I'm a believer in good governance, but I think it's a myth of the idea of good governance and policy making that it can be devoid of a political context and devoid of the context of the democracy in which all of this happens. And within that democracy as well, I think what we need to understand is that, be it party politics, be it politicians, be it their electoral politics, all of this needs to be understood if we are genuinely looking to make an impact. And so when I came this morning, when I was setting up my laptop for today morning's Zoom call, I deliberately kept it in this location itself, because I think that it is important to note that politics and electoral politics is very much a part of this citizen state engagement and our ability to have better governance and the difference that we want to make. So this is where I wanted to start from. And I'd like to share a bit of my own journey, because I think my own journey also reflects this entire, I have also been through various stages of working with nonprofits, of working with civil society movements, or working with students, then coming into politics, then from policy making in politics to getting into electoral politics has been my journey. And I think, which is why I would like to share some of that journey as well. I remember that when I was working with civil society organizations, and I'm sure that there are many people here who are on the various panels yesterday and today, and many of those who might be listening in, who themselves have civil society backgrounds. And when we were working in civil society organizations, and even in that field, I did a fair amount of work in school education. We would often go and work with governments, and we would often approach governments, asking them for running different programs. And, and I still remember you'd go, and often you would go to meet a bureaucrat or something whom you knew because of some personal connection or something or the other, or there's some relative of yours, or some father or some classmate of yours was an IAS officer who got you an introduction to them. And you would go meet them, and we would present what we thought were very good ideas. And they were very good ideas, many of them. And we would go and present them. And the interesting thing would be that the bureaucrats at the other end would make you feel as if they were doing you a favor, first, of course, by giving you any time. And then you would have presented a full plan, and they'd say, Dekho, we don't have that much money and we don't have that much resources. But तुम्हें ना 4 स्कूल में करना है, तो तुम 4 स्कूल ले लो और उसमें अपना एक्सपेरिमेंट कर लो और पायलट कर लो. And you have these 4 schools that you can work on. And so they would take about 5 to 10% of what was our plan and say that you should, so maybe you can do this. And that also was like a personal favor. कि तुम्हें तो उन्होंने भेजा है, तो इसलिए तुम 4 स्कूल कर लो. And whereas we used to think, we have very sound policy, and this would make a lot of difference. This can improve learning outcomes. This can improve children's learning levels, etc. But clearly, the equation was that the favor was being done to us. Second, I'll share another experience that Meenakshi ji mentioned the Jal Satyagraha as well. So I think for many of us in my generation, from the time we passed out of college and many years where we were working, for many of us, the Narmada Bachao Andolan was like rites of passage. I think anyone who had been active socially at that point of time was a part of Narmada Bachao Andolan at some point or the other, probably being one of the longest lasting social movements of the time. And at a time when, I think this was when one of the Jal Satyagrahas happened in Khandwa, I was there for almost a month at the site of the Jal Satyagraha. And in the interaction when the Jal Satyagraha happened, you had these 25 people literally standing in water for days and days and days. You could see that the skin on their feet was peeling off, on their legs were peeling off. They were clearly in a bad state. And the callousness of the state that they could not, let alone send a senior officer. They could not even send a Naib Tehsildar level officer to meet these people who were standing in the water. Second, finally, again, through some connections, we got an appointment at the Narmada Valley Development Corporation in Bhopal. And the officers there literally gave us 4 to 5 minutes to discuss the problems of the lives and livelihoods that affected hundreds of villagers at that point of time when that height of that dam was going to be reached. Now, the reason I mention both of these incidents is that they make us feel that there is that the state is not interested, that the state is not interested in citizens' voices. It makes one feel that state is not interested in civil society voices, state is not interested in voices of social movement. But I think, one of the things that I have realized over the years is that, yes, there is a problem to how the state functions, what are the motivations, etc. But I think there is a problem with our understanding as well of how to approach the state, how to approach governments and things. And that is what I had really come to. And, many of us who are working in civil society, we often, if you were to see, approach the problem as a, like in economics, you have supply and demand sides of the thing. So do in many ways democracy, and I'm sorry if I am offending anyone who might be on this panel, but democracy is also very much like the marketplace. It's a competitive setting, and whoever sells the best product or whoever people think has the best product for whatever reasons gets the most amount of buyers, in this case, the most amount of votes, and wins the election. So in that sense, an election or a democracy is also very much similar to the market. Now, what happens is that if you were to look at any politician, and I'm not just talking about myself or about Aam Aadmi Party, because people might think, "Acha, aap to enlightened log hain," etc. Jabki aisa kahin kuch hota nahi hai. I think that one has to understand the nature of politics and democracy. And what drives any political party or any politician? Now, what drives any political party or any politician is the desire to get re-elected. Once a politician or a government is in power, they are driven from their very first day from when they are in power as to how they will get re-elected again in 5 years' time. And from their day one of when they're elected, or even those who don't get elected, this is the debate here, because we are talking about the state and about governance. That is what I will focus on. So from the first day that they are elected, their entire driving force is the desire to get re-elected. That 5 saal baad jab phir se election hoga, main phir se kaise election jeetunga, be it my legislative assembly seat, be it a state government, be it my parliamentary seat. That is what defines and is the greatest motivator, I would say. That is the motivating factor behind the actions of any politician. Now, what happens? How do elections and electoral politics function in this country currently? Now, for any politician currently, and if I was to sort of generalize, for any politician currently, they think that there are 2 or 3 ways in which you can win an election. Number one, if you have a lot of money. And if you have a lot of money and if you spend a lot of money, be it on election ads, be it on television, now on social media, and or just the simple, most straightforward means of distributing money before the election and buying of votes, or giving liquor, saris, in South India, TVs, satellite dish TVs, what all and whatnot. So it's a simple means. You use the money, you buy the votes, you win the election. Now, this is this in Indian democracy is a tried and tested way of winning elections. So when we say that politicians are corrupt, it's actually, it's not the politicians who are corrupt. The politicians, they're not corrupt for the sake of being corrupt. Some of them might be, but they are basically corrupt because their worldview says that to win your next election, you need a lot of money. And since that is the motivating factor in politics and democracy, from the first day, they are busy accumulating that money. So when they are looking at education policy, for instance, they are thinking, अच्छा कौन से contractor से कितना पैसा ले सकते हैं, अगर SSA में इतना पैसा आ रहा है तो हम कितना पैसा खा लें, अगर नरेगा का इतना पैसा आ रहा है तो उसमें से हमारे पास कितना पैसा आएगा, उसके पास कितना पैसा आएगा, बिकॉज वो अपना हिसाब किताब लगा रहे हैं पहले दिन से कि मुझे 5 साल बाद इलेक्शन के लिए कितना पैसा चाहिए होगा. So this is the reason why a politician seems more interested in making money than maybe improving your schools, having better learning outcomes, etc. What is the second way? The second way is that there is caste politics or communal politics. So you divide people between a specific vote banks. Ki bhai, this SCs and OBCs will vote for this candidate, and these castes will vote for this candidate, and therefore, or in this seat, if you polarize the votes between Hindus and Muslims, then with these many number of votes, you can win this election. So then what is the second strategy that politicians will have in place is to flare these divides. Be it flare the divide between religions, be it to flare the divides between the different caste groups, or maybe have alliances based on their interests, but basically use these levers of change. Why? Because they think that this is what is going to win them their election. Now, so what you see is basically that why is the politician not interested in governance? Why is the politician not interested in saying, if I'm, for example, if I'm the education minister of X state or Y state, why am I far more interested in getting the contracts for the building of schools or the printing of textbooks than I am about the learning outcomes of children? Why I'm not interested is because I do not think that even if I improve the learning outcomes of children, that is going to improve my electoral prospects. And so that is the reason why when social movements like the Narmada Bachao Andolan, when non-profits like many of the people who have been working here, when we approach government, when people approach governments, people approach the state, people approach elected representatives, there is very limited interest in fact, interestingly, if you were to see, you might go to some MLAs and they might, even if they're a minister, they tell you, "Tum na meri constituency mein kar do. Ke whatever this program is, ke please meri constituency mein kar do." But they are not, because they think that that might have a limited impact and improve. But they are not interested. Why? Because they think that accumulating money or flaring caste or communal tensions is what is going to win the election. So now, where do civil society organizations come in? Where do citizens come in this picture? Where do social movements come in this picture? Now, what I believe, what is misplaced in our engagement with the state is that we, in this game of supply and demand, which I'm talking about in democracy. Now there is a problem. Now supposing that there is a problem that government schools are not functioning well. What do people like us do who are in civil society? People like us say, हम किताबें लिख देंगे, हम टेक्स्ट बुक्स नहीं बना देंगे, हम अच्छी वर्कबुक्स बना देंगे, हम एक बहुत अच्छी पेडागॉजी निकाल देंगे जिससे बच्चों का लर्निंग आउटकम्स बहुत ही एक स्पीडी तरीके से इंप्रूव हो जाएगा. This is, we will create new maths textbooks, we will create better ways of by which PDS is distributed, we will create this kind of healthcare MIS system for the government, etc. These are the kind of solutions that people like myself, and many of my friends and colleagues who have studied often public policy in very hallowed institutions, or many of us come up with these kind of solutions and we go to governments. Now, what we have to realize is that we are here looking to solve the supply problem, because we think कि हो सकता है ना उन्हें maths पढ़ाना आता नहीं हो सकता है उन्हें PDS distribution आता नहीं हो सकता है कि उनको healthcare का MIS system बनाना आता नहीं हो, तो we go with those solutions and we try to take over the supply side of the problem. Okay, we will take care. What we need to understand is that neither politicians nor government, no one is a fool. Okay, so if a government or a politician or a bureaucrat, I'm not discussing bureaucrats because that's another system of incentives and motivations that work there. But any government, for example, the state that we are talking about, if they want to find a solution to a problem, they can. They are not fools. I mean, elections are very complex problems. So the fact that they can win those things again and again, they can manage the politics, they can manage the communication, so politicians are not fools. So when they are not solving those problems, it is not because they can't. It is because they are not interested. Because there is no motivator for them to solve those problems. So what I personally think, and I think that, and here I'm not talking as a politician, I think maybe, but this is the insight that I have, like I'm sharing my insight, and here I'm speaking maybe more as a citizen. I think that what we need to do is not approach the problem from the supply side, but we need to approach the problem from the demand side. Where is the demand coming from? The demand has to come from citizens. See, after all, what is it that a politician wants? I said, a politician wants that they have to win the election. अब आखिर इलेक्शन में वोट कौन डालता है? इलेक्शन में वोट तो सिटीजन ही डालता है ना. So this citizen, whom social movements or civil society organizations are seeking to represent, or supposedly their voice whom they are representing, they also have their own voice. They have a constitutionally guaranteed and a very strong voice, which yes, maybe can be expressed only once in 5 years. But that voice is at one level far more powerful, statutory, constitutionally guaranteed than the voice of any civil society organization or social movement, etc. So those citizens have their own voice. And if that voice is expressed strongly and in the right direction, then that voice has a very strong impact. Like I know the fact that I'm a politician, I'm an elected representative. If there is anything that affects elected representatives, it is public pressure from the people who are going to vote for them. It is very straightforward and simple. So if actually we as civil society organizations, we as people who are engaged in social movements, want to have an impact on governance, then we have to, rather than working on the supply side, work on creating the demand side in citizens. So if I'm a politician and I know that जब मैं अपने अगले election में vote मांगने जाऊंगी, and when I knock at people's door, and when they come outside and they ask me, क्या आपने सरकारी स्कूल ठीक किया क्या? आपने सरकारी अस्पताल ठीक किया क्या? And if they were to say to me कि देखो आपने सरकारी स्कूल नहीं ठीक किया ना तो हम आपको वोट नहीं देंगे. If I know that my political future depends on the improvement of government schools, if I know that my political future depends on the improvement of government hospitals, of public service delivery, of PDS, public transport systems, what have you, all of the things that mostly don't work across the board in our governance systems across the country. If I as a politician know the fact that my electoral victory depends on it, then I can give it to you today in writing, that not just an Aam Aadmi party who might seem enlightened and interested in these issues, and not just because it's Delhi and you might have different politics over here, but every politician from every political party from every part of the country will deliver good government schools and will deliver good government hospitals and will deliver good public delivery systems. Because this is what drives a politician. So I think that if we are looking as civil society organizations, and frankly, I can't say this enough, and I say this everywhere that I speak to any civil society organizations, we have to work towards creating this demand. We have to make sure that education, public education, becomes a political issue, becomes an electoral issue. We have to, as civil society organizations, make sure that providing good public healthcare systems becomes an electoral issue. We have to ensure that provision of good public transport systems becomes an electoral issue. Providing proper PDS, providing proper food security becomes an electoral issue on which elections are fought and on which elections are won and lost. And I think this really, according to me, is the most crucial piece if we as civil society have to look to transform and have an impact on government policy. Because otherwise what happens is, and I think I'd also like, if I was to share a personal journey from myself or from a lot of other colleagues who have been working in the field, I think after about having done this for a decade, everyone becomes jaded and everyone says, ki bhai, hota to hai nahi kuch. And you keep trying, but you actually have no impact. And I think that at the end of maybe a decade of doing this, you think, bhai, 10 saal humne apni zindagi laga di. We have burnt the midnight oil. We have worked 12 to 16 hours a day. And we have been able to transform a sum total of 20 villages in our entire lifetime. Whereas if we are able to affect our democracy, if we are able to affect our politics, if we are able to affect the variables on which elections are won and lost. Today, if I was to compare myself to my experiences in civil society to where I stand today, if I had for the last 5 years been working in a civil society organization in the field of education, then even in the best and most effective and most efficient of organizations, I may have been able to have an impact on 5,000 children, 10,000 children. But because I was in politics and because I was with a political party that was in power in Delhi, and therefore I was an advisor to the education minister, because of that reason, over a period of 5 years, I was able to touch the lives of more than 20 lakh children. And I think this is the power of politics. This is the power of democracy. And when we have the privilege of living in a democratic country, where we have the privilege of having free and fair elections, where at the end of 5 years, we know the fact that there is going to be a vote cast, and whoever is the prime minister or chief minister or whatever can't just get up and say, "Is bari election nahi hone wala, main continue karne wala hu." I think we have to use that privilege. I think that is the power of a democracy. And I think that it is citizens, the vote is the citizens' most powerful voice. Far more powerful, I personally believe, than a civil society organization, far more powerful than a social movement. So I think the biggest impact that a civil society organization or a social movement can have is to strengthen that citizen's voice, to strengthen that voter's voice, and to make sure that their vote actually falls not on issues that don't affect their lives. You can have voters going into in areas where they may be spending a third of their income on sending their child to a private school because government schools in their area are bad. And yet they are voting the same politicians in power again and again because they don't see this linkage between their vote and the fate of their children's education, because they don't see that linkage between their vote and the money that they have to spend in sending their child to a so-called English medium school. They don't see the link between their vote and the money they had to spend in a private hospital because for their family members' ailment, because the government healthcare system does not work. I think the day the voters are able to see this linkage and the day voters vote according to this, I think that would be the day when people like you and I can go back to having more normal lives and not have to spend our time on issues of public policy and governance, and or maybe spend far less time on issues of public policy and governance, and governments would be able to find their solutions. Thank you.